The pencil trembled in Major Francis Gabreski's hand, not from fear, from something else entirely. Something the British pilot said was impossible just 8 months ago when they first saw the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and laughed, called it a flying milk bottle, told the Americans they'd be slaughtered. But Gabreski wasn't laughing now. Neither were the Luftwaffe pilots whose wreckage was scattered across the frozen fields below Bremen. November 26, 1943. He wrote one sentence in his log that would change everything anyone thought they knew about aerial combat. The Luftwaffe will learn to fear the dive. We have discovered something they cannot match. What he'd just witnessed through that frost-covered canopy at 28,000 feet shouldn't have been possible according to every rule written since the First World War. His pilots didn't turn to fight. They didn't chase. They didn't dogfight. They did something that defied every instinct. Hammered into fighter pilots since the Red Baron, they rolled their massive 4-ton fighters upside down and dove straight toward the earth, like thunderbolts thrown by an angry god. 500 miles per hour, speeds that would rip the wings off any other fighter in the European theater. The Messerschmitt pilots never even saw death coming from directly above. One moment, they're climbing confidently toward the American bombers, calculating their attack angles, feeling that familiar rush before the kill. The next moment, 850 caliber machine guns are shredding their fuselages from a fighter that materialized out of the sun itself. By the time their brains processed what was happening, the American was already gone. Climbing. Impossibly climbing back to altitude while they're still trying to figure out which direction the attack came from. The mathematics of air combat were being rewritten, not in turning radius, not in climb rate, in the brutal physics of a 4-ton fighter achieving terminal velocity in a controlled dive, then converting all that accumulated kinetic energy into a zoom climb that put them right back where they started. Untouchable, unstoppable, 60 seconds from dive to recovery. Just 60 seconds. Gabreski destroyed 2 Bf-110s that morning using tactics that shouldn't have worked. Tactics that made the so-called experts shake their heads. But the wreckage didn't care about expert opinions. The dead German pilots didn't care about conventional wisdom. And the bomber crews who made it home, because P-47s were diving out of the sun like avenging angels, they understood something the critics never would. Sometimes the path to victory isn't the one everyone expects. Sometimes it's straight down at 500 miles per hour. But 8 months earlier, nobody believed that. Nobody. April 13th, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission over occupied France. The pilots were terrified. They'd spent 8 months training on this beast called the Thunderbolt, and most of them were convinced it was going to get them killed. 14,000 pounds fully loaded. Some configurations pushed past 17,000. The heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. It outweighed the elegant Supermarine Spitfire by 4,000 pounds. Made the Focke-Wulf 190 look like a child's toy. Critics called it the 7-ton milk jug. RAF pilots who defended Britain in nimble Spitfires took one. Look at this American monster and openly questioned whether it could survive against experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson was one of those terrified pilots. Fresh from training, convinced he'd be dead within a week, his hands shook during the pre-flight briefing. He looked at the massive P-47 sitting on the tarmac, engines already rumbling, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. The aircraft looked wrong, felt wrong, like flying a locomotive with wings. How was this supposed to outmaneuver the fighters that had terrorized Europe for 4 years? But what Johnson didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that they were asking the wrong question entirely. The P-47 wasn't built to outmaneuver anyone. It was built for something the world had never seen before. Deep in the belly of that massive fuselage sat the key to everything. A Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, 2,000 horsepower at sea level, with water injection that jumped to 2,300 horsepower for combat emergencies. Some later variants would push 2,800 horsepower. But raw power wasn't the secret. Plenty of engines had power. The secret was buried in the rear fuselage. A turbo supercharger system so sophisticated that German engineers would spend years trying to replicate it. Exhaust gases screamed through ducting along both sides of the cockpit, driving a General Electric turbine that spun at over 21,000 revolutions per minute. This turbine compressed incoming air, fed it through an intercooler, and pumped it back to the engine. The result was revolutionary in ways most pilots didn't understand until they experienced it firsthand. This system allowed the R-2800 to produce maximum power at 27,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, in the thin stratosphere where other fighters gasped and wheezed and lost performance, the Thunderbolt remained faster and more powerful than any German fighter in existence. It could operate effectively up to 42,000 feet, an altitude where Luftwaffe pilots found their aircraft barely responding to controls. But this remarkable capability came with massive weight. The turbocharger system, with all its complex ducting, extensive armor plating protecting the pilot, including a 69-pound armored headrest, self-sealing fuel tanks holding 370 gallons internally, 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns with 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds of ammunition total. Empty weight alone exceeded 9,900 pounds. Combat-loaded weight pushed past 14,000 before any external stores were added. The skeptics looked at these numbers and saw a disaster waiting to happen. A flying tank that would turn like a garbage truck and accelerate like a freight train. Lieutenant Johnson wrote after that first mission, "I saw the challenges ahead. The Germans had been fighting for years. We were entering combat in an aircraft that many believed was the wrong tool for the job. Yet Colonel Zemke seemed confident we would find our way. Colonel Hubert Zemke, the man who would figure out what everyone else was missing. The man who would turn the P-47 from a laughingstock into the most feared fighter in the European theater. But first, his pilots had to survive long enough to learn. Those first missions, through late April and into May 1943, were cautious operations. Fighter sweeps over the coast, learning the terrain, testing equipment, building experience gradually without rushing into major engagements that could devastate an inexperienced unit. Nobody was in a hurry to prove anything. Not yet. Then June 12, 1943 changed everything. A mission designated RAF Rodeo 204 over the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 at lower altitude near Blankenberg. He was positioned higher, much higher, and Colonel Zemke had been drilling one concept into his pilots' heads relentlessly. Altitude is life. So Cook did something simple, something that would seem obvious in hindsight but was revolutionary in practice. He dove on the unsuspecting German fighter from above. Throttle to maximum, nose pointed down, speed building, 300 miles per hour, 400, 450. The Focke-Wulf never saw him. Cook fired a burst from his .850 caliber guns. The convergence pattern at that range was devastating. The FW-190 tumbled toward the ground, trailing smoke. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed aerial victory, and it had been achieved using altitude advantage and a diving attack. Not turning, not dogfighting, diving. The very next day, June 13th, brought 3 more victories using identical tactics. Lieutenant Johnson scored his first kill that day, diving from altitude onto an FW-190 over Bruges. The German pilot never saw him coming. Johnson fired, saw strikes, watched the enemy fighter spin into the ground. When he landed, Major General Karl Spaatz personally presented him with a bottle of Scotch whiskey. But Johnson also learned a brutal lesson that day about discipline. His element leader hadn't followed to provide cover during the attack. Johnson found himself isolated, surrounded by German fighters. He was reprimanded despite his confirmed kill. The message was clear. Individual glory meant nothing if pilots died being reckless. But none of those early missions prepared anyone for what test pilots had discovered months earlier back in the United States. November 13, 1942, before the 56th Fighter Group even deployed to England, Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dicer pushed their P-47C Thunderbolts into near-vertical dives from 35,000 feet during high-altitude performance testing. What happened next was both terrifying and illuminating. Their airspeed indicators climbed past 500 miles per hour, past 600, eventually showing 725 miles per hour indicated. Republic Aviation would later claim they'd exceeded the speed of sound, become the first humans to break the sound barrier. The claim was disputed. General Hap Arnold sent a telegram ordering no more discussion about the dive. The actual true airspeed was probably in the 550 to 600 range. But what mattered wasn't the exact number. What mattered was what they experienced beyond 550 miles per hour. Compressibility effects. As localized airflow over the wings approached transonic velocities, the controls became rigid, completely unresponsive. Both aircraft were diving nearly straight down, accelerating continuously. Conventional recovery seemed impossible. Both pilots experienced tunnel vision from the G-forces, genuine terror as their aircraft plunged earthward with frozen controls, the ground rushing up, altimeters unwinding impossibly fast. This was how it ended. But then Comstock and Dicer both discovered something. They pushed firmly on the control stick with both hands, kept trim tabs locked in neutral, maintained steady pressure. No desperate yanking, no panic inputs, just firm, consistent pressure while the aircraft descended through the compressibility region. As they descended into denser air at lower altitudes, usually below 15,000 feet, something magical happened. The compressibility effects gradually diminished. The elevators slowly regained effectiveness. The aircraft began responding to control inputs. Both pilots completed their pullouts with less than 2,000 feet to spare. Their bodies compressed into their seats by forces exceeding 7 or 8 times gravity. When they landed and reported their experience, the response was immediate. Every P-47 pilot would receive extensive training in recognizing compressibility onset and executing proper recovery procedures. More importantly, engineers discovered that the P-47's thick wing design, which made it a poor turner, actually delayed the onset of critical compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt could dive faster and recover more reliably than any contemporary fighter in the world. This wasn't a bug. It was the feature nobody had been looking for. Throughout May and June 1943, Colonel Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly in tactics that would exploit this discovery. The doctrine was simple, but counterintuitive to everything fighter pilots had learned. Climb to 30,000 feet or higher before reaching the combat area. Maintain disciplined formation with proper spacing for mutual support. Never chase enemy fighters down to low altitude where the P-47's weaknesses in turning and acceleration were exposed. When enemies appeared below, roll inverted to keep the target in sight. Pull 4 to 5 Gs to point the nose downward. Dive at maximum throttle. The accumulated speed, often exceeding 480 miles per hour, and sometimes reaching 500 or more, made the P-47 nearly impossible for German fighters to evade. Fire a burst from 850 caliber machine guns, each gun cycling at approximately 800 rounds per minute. Combined rate of fire around 6,400 rounds per minute, over 100 rounds per second. At high closing speeds, even a 2-second burst delivered devastating firepower. Then, before German fighters could react, pull back firmly on the stick. Use all that kinetic energy to zoom, climb back above the fight. Regain altitude advantage within 40 to 60 seconds. The entire attack sequence consumed less than 90 seconds and required minimal fuel. A German fighter attempting to climb from 20,000 feet to 30,000 feet required 4 to 6 minutes and consumed significant fuel while their engine lost power continuously as altitude increased. The skeptics remained numerous through those early months. Many pilots found it difficult to abandon traditional fighter tactics. Some questioned whether running away in a dive could truly be called fighting. Then, June 26, 1943, taught everyone a lesson they'd never forget. 48 P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were escorting B-17 bombers, returning from a mission to Villers-Coublay. They were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 near Forges-les-Eaux. The engagement was chaotic, violent. Lieutenant Johnson's P-47, nicknamed Half Pint, was hit early by multiple 20mm cannon shells. His canopy shattered, hydraulic lines severed, spraying fluid across his windscreen. The cockpit caught fire briefly. Shrapnel from exploding cannon shells struck Johnson's nose, causing bleeding and partial disorientation. Most pilots would have bailed out immediately, but Johnson discovered his canopy wouldn't open. He was trapped in a dying fighter. With no choice but to fly or die, Johnson did the only thing Zemke's doctrine allowed. He pushed the nose down and dove for the English Channel at maximum speed. An FW-190 followed, firing repeatedly into the already crippled P-47. More cannon shells tore through wings and fuselage. The German pilot apparently expended all his ammunition on the defenseless American. Then he flew alongside, looked directly at Johnson, saluted, and broke away. Whether this represented respect for courage or simply acknowledgement that further attacks were pointless, Johnson never knew. But that massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine continued running despite taking multiple hits. The robust airframe held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson coaxed the battered P-47 across the English Channel, found RAF Manston Emergency Airfield, executed a perfect landing despite having almost no forward visibility. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes without completely circling the aircraft. The right wing had structural members severed. The fuselage had holes large enough to insert a fist, yet Johnson walked away with only minor injuries. And remarkably, the P-47 was eventually repaired and returned to service. This mission cost the 56th Fighter Group 4 aircraft, their worst single loss to date. But it demonstrated something as important as the diving tactics themselves. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would obliterate any other fighter and still bring pilots home alive. This wasn't just about offense anymore. It was about survivability. A pilot could press attacks aggressively knowing that even if hit, the aircraft could likely carry him home. That psychological confidence enabled more aggressive tactics and better mission results. August 17, 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The first major validation of diving attack tactics on a large scale. The 8th Air Force launched 376 heavy bombers in a daring double strike against ball-bearing factories deep in Germany. The bombers would fly hundreds of miles beyond escort range. The P-47s were assigned to take them as far as fuel allowed. Major Gabreski positioned his flights at 30,000 feet. 5,000 feet above the bomber stream, German fighters were climbing from multiple airfields. Approximately 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s timing their arrival to catch the bombers when escorts would be at fuel limits. What the German pilots didn't expect was coordinated diving, attacks from superior altitude. Multiple P-47 flights rolled inverted simultaneously, pointed their noses at steep angles between 45 and 60 degrees, accelerated toward climbing German fighters at speeds the Luftwaffe had never encountered from American fighters before. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes and spread across 70 miles of German and Belgian airspace. P-47 pilots executed textbook diving attacks, struck hard, recovered to altitude for repeated attacks. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 German fighters destroyed. German records documented 22 aircraft lost that day with 11 pilots killed. Among the dead was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Gruppenkommandeur of the QG JG-26, brother of the famous General Adolf Galland. 55 victories before encountering P-47 diving tactics he couldn't counter. Captain Walker Mahurin was credited with the probable kill, diving from altitude at over 480 miles per hour, striking Galland's FW-190 with concentrated burst. The German fighter disintegrated. Galland's body was found 2 months later, still strapped in his seat, driven 12 feet into the ground by impact. The psychological effect on remaining JG-26 pilots was profound. One of their most experienced leaders killed by tactics he never saw coming. October 1943 brought full maturation of P-47 diving tactics. The missions that month showed what properly trained pilots using correct doctrine could achieve. October 4th, escort mission to Frankfurt. The 56th encountered approximately 60 German fighters attempting to intercept the bomber stream. Using altitude advantage and disciplined diving attacks, they destroyed approximately 15 twin-engine Bf-110s, along with single-engine fighters. Claimed 16 total victories while losing 2 P-47s to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. October 8th. Lieutenant Johnson spotted an FW-190 attacking another P-47 from the pilot's blind spot. Positioned at 29,000 feet over Bremen, Johnson rolled inverted, pulled 4 Gs to point to his nose at the German fighter, pushed throttle to maximum emergency power. At 26,000 feet and 460 miles per hour, he squeezed the trigger, saw pieces flying off the FW-190 before it rolled over and fell spinning. Johnson immediately pulled back to zoom climb, gained 3,000 feet of altitude in less than 30 seconds, was back in position to assist squadron members within 1 minute. The entire attack sequence from initial roll-in to altitude recovery took approximately 50 seconds. This was boom and zoom tactics executed to perfection. 2 days later, October 10th, Johnson became an ace during massive engagement over Münster. In the swirling battle, Johnson executed 3 separate diving attacks within 25 minutes, destroyed 1 Messerschmitt Bf-110, twin-engine fighter and 1 Focke-Wulf FW-190. Brought his total score to 5 confirmed victories. Unknown to Johnson at the time, one of these victories was Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of JG-1, 200, 6 total victories including 100. 77 on the Eastern Front. Johnson wouldn't learn this pilot's identity until 50 years later when researchers compared combat reports. But Johnson paid a price for pressing attacks aggressively. During his final diving run, he was hit by return fire from a Bf-110's rear defensive gunner. 20mm cannon shells tore through right wing and fuselage. The P-47 began smoking. German fighters recognized a crippled opponent and moved in for the kill. 3 separate times, FW-190s attempted to finish Johnson off. 3 times, Johnson pushed his nose down, built speed to over 400 miles per hour despite damaged controls, and pulled away from pursuers, even critically damaged. The P-47 could still outdive any German fighter in existence. Johnson nursed the shaking, smoking aircraft across Belgium and over the English Channel, found an emergency landing field, brought the battered fighter down in textbook landing. Ground crews counted damage and marveled he'd survived. Over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes, right wing with structural members severed, fuselage with holes penetrating deep into critical systems. But that massive R-2800 had continued running smoothly. The airframe held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson walked away without serious injury. By November 1943, the 56th Fighter Group's tactical doctrine was being adopted throughout the 8th Air Force. Every P-47 unit learned to think vertically rather than horizontally. Altitude was life, speed was survival, discipline was victory. Never chase an enemy down to his altitude unless absolutely necessary. Never turn when you can dive. Never engage fairly when you can attack with overwhelming advantage. The kill ratio statistics from this period demonstrate extraordinary effectiveness. When considering only aircraft lost to enemy fighters in air combat, the 56th achieved ratios approaching 11-1. Even including all operational losses from mechanical failures, weather, and ground fire, the ratio remained above 5-1. When examining only engagements where P-47 pilots maintained altitude discipline, kill ratios exceeded 15-1, occasionally approached 20-1 in ideal conditions. The tactics worked because they exploited fundamental physics that couldn't be countered by pilot skill or tactical innovation. A P-47 at 30,000 feet had potential energy equivalent to 9.4 million foot-pounds. When diving to 20,000 feet, this converted to kinetic energy, producing speeds approaching or exceeding 500 miles per hour. No German fighter could safely match this speed. The FW-190's maximum dive speed was limited to approximately 450, indicated before structural concerns became critical. The Bf-109 faced similar limitations, with additional control difficulties at high speeds. After firing on target at 20,000 feet, a P-47 pilot pulling 4 to 5 Gs in recovery could climb back to 28 or 29,000 feet, using accumulated kinetic energy. The entire attack cycle consumed less than 90 seconds and required minimal fuel. A German fighter attempting to climb from 20,000 to 30,000 required 4 to 6 minutes and consumed significant fuel while the engine lost power continuously. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots became measurably significant. German combat reports increasingly mentioned avoiding engagement with P-47s above 25,000 feet. Some squadrons began refusing to climb to high altitude altogether. Major Günther Rau, who commanded the Seku JG-11 briefly in 1944 before being shot down and wounded, provided insight in post-war interviews. By late 1943, experienced German pilots recognized the P-47 was most dangerous when it had altitude advantage. American pilots were learning to use their aircraft correctly, refusing to be lured down to altitudes where German fighters had advantages. Instead, P-47s attacked repeatedly from above, diving so fast German pilots could barely track them visually, firing quick bursts and climbing away before effective response was possible. If German fighters climbed to meet them, the Americans simply climbed higher, using superior high-altitude performance. Rau survived the war with 275 total victories, third highest score in aviation history. The diving tactics required exceptional physical conditioning. Pulling out of a 500-mile-per-hour dive generated G-forces exceeding 7 times gravity. Blood drained from the brain toward lower body. Vision narrowed to a tunnel. Some pilots lost consciousness briefly at the bottom of dives. To counter this, P-47 pilots developed anti-G straining techniques borrowed from dive bomber operations. They tensed leg muscles and abdominal muscles vigorously during pullout, grunted or shouted loudly, forcing air pressure into lungs and chest cavity. Learned to limit pullout to 6 or 6.5 Gs when possible. These techniques, combined with youth and fitness, allowed most pilots to remain conscious and effective. But the physical toll accumulated. Pilots who flew multiple high-intensity missions returned to base physically exhausted, bodies aching from repeated high-G maneuvers. January 11, 1944. Escort mission to Oschersleben deep in central Germany. The 56th encountered over 100 German fighters in desperate attempt to destroy the bomber stream. The engagement lasted nearly 1 hour and spread across 150 miles of German airspace. Major Gabreski personally executed 6 separate diving attacks during the extended engagement, destroyed 3 enemy aircraft and damaged 2 more. His combat report described it as the most intense mission he'd experienced. The 56th claimed 22 German fighters destroyed for loss of 4 P-47s. Kill ratio of approximately 5.5 to 1. More significantly, bomber losses were far lower than expected during the period when P-47 escort was present. February 1944 brought Operation Argument, known to participants as Big Week. 6 days of maximum effort bombing from February 20th through 25th against German aircraft production facilities. The 8th Air Force launched over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties. The Luftwaffe responded with everything available. The 56th Fighter Group flew 16 major missions during Big Week and immediate aftermath. The diving tactics perfected over 9 months of combat were now being executed by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience against German pilots with decreasing experience levels. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Through Big Week and into first half of March, the 56th destroyed approximately 87 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. February 20th, escort to Leipzig, they destroyed 15 German fighters without loss. February 22nd, escorting bombers to Halberstadt, they destroyed 12 more. The accumulated effect broke the Luftwaffe's ability to effectively defend German airspace in daylight. German fighter units were losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could produce replacements. New German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight time, often less than 50 hours in type compared to American pilots arriving with 150 to 200 hours. These inexperienced German pilots were particularly vulnerable to P-47 diving attacks. They lacked situational awareness to see attackers coming from above, made mistakes in defensive maneuvering, panicked, and dove away reflexively, playing directly into the P-47's greatest strength. By March 1944, air superiority over Germany was largely achieved. German fighters still appeared, but in smaller numbers with noticeably less aggressive tactics. March 6th, the 56th flew escort all the way to Berlin and back, without encountering a single German fighter willing to engage at high altitude. The Luftwaffe had learned through painful experience that engaging P-47s above 25,000 feet was nearly suicidal. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski achieved his final victory on July 5, 1944, 28 confirmed kills, all flying P-47 Thunderbolts with the 56th Fighter Group. 15 days later, July 20th, his luck ran out. While strafing Bassenheim airfield at low altitude, his P-47 struck the ground. Damaged propeller forced crash landing in German-held territory. He was captured and spent final 9 months of war as prisoner. In post-war interviews, Gabreski consistently credited diving attack tactics for the 56th success. When we arrived in England in January 1943, most pilots believed the P-47 was too heavy and cumbersome to be effective. British pilots told us we'd be slaughtered. Then Colonel Zemke showed us a different approach. We stopped trying to turn with German fighters, started using our real advantages: altitude performance, diving speed, structural strength. We attacked from above, struck hard, recovered to altitude before enemy could respond. Suddenly, we were winning. Robert Johnson finished his combat tour with 27 confirmed victories in 91 missions. First, USAF fighter pilot in Europe to exceed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I score of 26 victories. Johnson was rotated home in May 1944 and spent remainder of war on publicity tours. In his memoir Thunderbolt, Johnson emphasized importance of discipline and tactical doctrine. Individual courage and flying skill mattered, but properly executed tactics based on aircraft capabilities mattered more. A mediocre pilot following correct doctrine would defeat an excellent pilot using incorrect tactics. The final statistics demonstrate ultimate success of diving attack doctrine. From April 1943 through April 1945, the 56th Fighter Group flew 447 combat missions, achieved 674 and 1/2 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other fighter group in 8th Air Force, lost 60 aircraft to enemy fighters in air-to-air combat. Kill ratio of 11.2 to 1. When including all operational losses totaling 128 aircraft from all causes, kill ratio remained approximately 5.3 to 1. These statistics represented not just numbers, but lives saved and missions accomplished. The P-47's overall performance across all theaters validated the diving attack approach. The Thunderbolt flew over 746,000 sorties during World War II, achieved aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, while losing 3,499 aircraft to all causes in combat. This overall ratio masked substantial variation. Groups that consistently employed proper high-altitude diving tactics achieved kill ratios between 8 to 1 and 15 to 1. Units that deviated from doctrine or operated primarily at low altitudes achieved much lower ratios. The technical specifications that enabled these tactics represented masterpiece of engineering. The P-47D variant featured wingspan of 40 feet 9 inches, length of 36 feet 1 inch, height of 14 feet 8 inches. Combat loaded weight varied from 14,000 to 17,500 pounds depending on external stores. Maximum speed reached 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Rate of climb approximately 2,700 feet per minute at sea level, increasing at altitude due to turbocharger effectiveness. Service ceiling 42,000 feet. Combat radius with external. Tanks reached approximately 460 miles. The armament of 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns provided sustained firepower for approximately 30 seconds of continuous firing. In practice, pilots fired in short bursts of 1 to 3 seconds, making ammunition last for 10 to 15 separate engagements. The 50 caliber round could penetrate aircraft aluminum structure, damage engines, rupture fuel tanks, and incapacitate pilots at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 59 engine displaced 2,800 cubic inches across 18 cylinders. At rated power, produced 2,000 horsepower, with water methanol injection activated as war emergency power. Output increased to 2,300 horsepower for up to 5 minutes. The turbocharger system represented most sophisticated aspect of design. The General Electric Type B11 turbo supercharger used exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders to spin turbine wheel at up to 21,300 revolutions per minute. This turbine drove centrifugal compressor that pressurized incoming air to sea level equivalent density, even at 30,000 feet. The compressed air passed through intercooler that reduced temperature and increased density before entering engine's supercharger for final compression. This two-stage system allowed R-2800 to maintain maximum rated power up to 27,000 feet. The structural design featured remarkable robustness. Main wing spar could withstand loads exceeding 8G positive or 3.5G negative. Fuselage, longerons, and bulkheads were designed for crash loads that would protect pilot even in severe accidents. Armor protection included 69-pound armored headrest, quarter-inch armor plate behind pilot's seat, 3/8-inch armor plate protecting engine accessories, and bulletproof glass windscreen panels. Self-sealing fuel tanks contained rubber and fabric layers that would swell when punctured, sealing holes and preventing catastrophic fuel leakage. German fighters attempting to counter these tactics faced impossible choices. Climb to meet P-47s at altitude where American performance advantages were maximized. Attempt to lure them down where German advantages lay, but P-47 pilots refused to follow. Or avoid engagement entirely and concede air superiority. The impact extended beyond immediate combat results into broader strategic effects. The Luftwaffe's failure to defend German airspace in 1944 stemmed partly from unsustainable pilot losses inflicted by P-47s and other American fighters. German training programs couldn't replace experienced pilots quickly enough. New pilots with minimal training became easy targets. The accumulating experience advantage compounded over time. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded in destroying German oil production, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and transportation networks. This success depended absolutely on fighter escorts achieving air superiority. The P-47's contribution through diving attacks from altitude represented one of decisive factors enabling Allied victory in Europe. The lessons learned influenced fighter design and doctrine for decades afterward. Post-war analysis confirmed that boom and zoom tactics, exploiting superior speed and energy management, were fundamentally more effective than traditional turning dogfights when facing comparable opponents. Francis Gabreski flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, applying same energy management principles he learned in P-47s over Germany. Shot down 6.5 MiG-15s, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 different wars. The tactics that worked against FW-190s and Bf-109s over Germany worked equally well against MiG-15s over Korea. Maintain altitude advantage. Dive on enemy at high speed. Fire quick burst. Zoom climb back to safety. The aircraft and speeds changed, but fundamental, tactical principles remained valid. German prisoners interviewed after war consistently identified P-47 diving attacks as among most frightening experiences of aerial combat. Oberleutnant Heinrich Bahr, who surrendered in March 1945 after surviving years of combat, told American intelligence officers the P-47 represented psychological terror beyond its physical capabilities. You would be climbing to engage bombers, and suddenly your wingman would explode beside you. You'd look up and see American fighters diving nearly vertically at impossible speeds. By the time you reacted, they were already pulling up and climbing away, completely untouchable. You couldn't catch them climbing, couldn't evade them diving, could only hope they'd choose different target next time. Modern computer, simulations using authentic flight models and performance data have confirmed what P-47 pilots discovered through combat experience. In engagements where the P-47 maintained altitude discipline and used diving attacks exclusively, kill ratios exceeded 20-1 against comparable German fighters. Only when P-47 pilots violated doctrine and engaged in low-altitude turning fights did German fighters achieve favorable exchange ratios. The lesson was unambiguous. Tactics that exploited an aircraft's actual strengths would always defeat tactics based on wishful thinking about desired capabilities. The P-47 wasn't the most agile fighter, wasn't the best climbing fighter below 20,000 feet, wasn't the longest range fighter until late variants appeared, but it was the fastest diving fighter, most survivable fighter, and most capable high-altitude fighter in existence. Tactics built around these real strengths produced extraordinary results. The 56th Fighter Group's achievement stands as one of great tactical success stories of World War II. They took an aircraft critics claimed was too heavy and clumsy for air combat, identified its actual advantages through systematic analysis, developed tactics that exploited those advantages while minimizing exposure to disadvantages, trained relentlessly until execution became instinctive, maintained discipline under most stressful combat conditions imaginable. Colonel Hubert Zemke later reflected on the transformation. When I took command in September 1942, I had an aircraft everyone said was wrong for the mission, and pilots terrified they'd be slaughtered by experienced German pilots. I had to find what the P-47 could do well and build tactics around those capabilities. The dive became everything. We could dive faster than anyone, could recover from dives that would kill other pilots, could zoom, climb back to altitude, and do it again. Once we mastered this, we became unstoppable. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately about triumph of analysis over assumption, discipline over improvisation, physics over tradition. Every expert in early 1943 knew heavy fighters couldn't succeed against light, agile opponents. Every assumption about aerial combat since First World War emphasized turning ability and climb rate. Every fighter pilot wanted light, responsive aircraft that could outmaneuver enemy in twisting dogfights. Then, a group of American pilots led by Hubert Zemke climbed to 30,000 feet in the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, rolled inverted, pushed the stick forward, and discovered that every conventional assumption was wrong. They found that straight down at 500 miles per hour was the fastest path to victory, that the zoom climb back to altitude was the most effective defensive maneuver ever conceived. They proved that an aircraft's true capability mattered infinitely more than conventional wisdom about what fighters should be able to do. The Germans who witnessed these tactics from the receiving end never forgot the lesson. Neither did the Americans who flew the missions. The P-47 pilots started diving straight down because analysis showed it was most effective way to attack. They continued diving straight down because combat results proved the analysis correct. They achieved kill ratios approaching 20-1 in ideal conditions because physics and proper tactics are more powerful than courage and tradition. That's how you win air superiority. That's how you protect bombers conducting strategic missions. That's how you bring pilots home, alive despite facing experienced enemies. You identify your aircraft's true strengths through rigorous analysis. You develop tactics that exploit those strengths while minimizing exposure to weaknesses. You train those tactics until execution becomes instinctive. You maintain discipline even when instinct screams to abandon doctrine. You roll inverted at 30,000 feet. You point your nose at the earth. You accelerate to 500 miles per hour. You fire a precise burst. You pull back firmly on the stick and climb back to altitude before anyone can respond. Do it right. Do it with discipline. Do it with mutual support, and no enemy pilot in the sky can touch you. That was the secret the 56th Fighter Group discovered through months of analysis, training, and combat experience. That was the tactical revolution that changed aerial warfare and helped achieve air superiority over Germany. That was why P-47 pilots started diving straight down, and that was why they achieved kill ratios that approached 20-to-1 in ideal conditions. The answer wasn't courage, though courage was required. The answer wasn't superior aircraft, though the P-47 had advantages. The answer was superior tactics, rigorously based on physics and executed with unwavering discipline. That combination proved unstoppable, because in the end, gravity doesn't negotiate. Kinetic energy doesn't compromise. And a 4-ton fighter diving at 500 miles per hour doesn't ask permission. It just arrives like thunder from heaven, strikes with the fury of 850 caliber machine guns, and disappears back into the sun before the enemy even understands what happened. The Luftwaffe learned to fear the dive, but by the time they learned, it was already too late. The sky over Germany belonged to the Thunderbolts now, and the bombers they protected were systematically dismantling the Third Reich, one mission at a time. The war would continue for another year after Big Week, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The P-47's diving from altitude had broken the Luftwaffe's back. The bomber streams would reach their targets. The factories would burn. The oil refineries would stop producing. The transportation networks would collapse, and thousands of American bomber crewmen would survive to come home, because somewhere above them, at 30,000 feet, a P-47 pilot was rolling inverted and beginning another dive. That pencil that trembled in Major Gabreski's hand back in November 1943 had written the truth. The Luftwaffe had learned to fear the dive. They discovered something they couldn't match. And that discovery, that simple revelation that sometimes the answer is straight down at maximum speed, had changed everything. The milk jug that everyone laughed at had become the hammer that forged victory, and the pilots who learned to wield that hammer with precision and discipline had written one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of aerial warfare. The sky remembers. The wrecked German fighters scattered across France and Germany remember. The bomber crews who made it home remember. And somewhere in the physics of potential energy converting to kinetic energy, in the mathematics of dive angles and zoom climbs, in the brutal simplicity of gravity harnessed by human ingenuity, the lesson remains. Sometimes the path to victory isn't the one everyone expects. Sometimes it's straight down, at 500 miles per hour, with 850 caliber machine guns screaming defiance at everything conventional wisdom said was impossible. That's the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt. That's the legacy of the 56th Fighter Group. That's what happens when analysis defeats assumption, when discipline conquers chaos, when physics proves more powerful than tradition. The thunder from heaven that changed aerial warfare forever, and the men who learned to ride that thunder all the way to victory.